Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel this afternoon with open Q&A on the Azure migration journey. We're super excited to be joined by a large panel of experts today, and what I'd like to ask each of them to do to start out with is to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their area of expertise. Then we have a short presentation just to ground us all in the principles and the structure that we use to think about migration here at Microsoft, and then we're going to open it up to questions. We also have some basic questions that we've heard from customers reliably over this, for certainly the last 6 months, as more and more customers have joined us on this path to the cloud. So I think we'll have a good mix of both content that we think might be interesting to you, and then of course openness to your questions and areas that you'd like to explore. So let's go ahead and start with introductions. Anant, if you'd like to begin.
Yeah. Hey, it's great to be here. My name is Anant Sundaram. I've met some of you at prior Ignites. So I've been at Microsoft for 15 years, the last decade of which has been spent on Azure, first on the technical side and now on the business side of the house. So I really look forward to sharing some of my learnings and thoughts working with you guys.
All right. Hi, guys. I'm Iqbal Zafar. I specifically work on the database migration service team. My larger team also handles SQL Server Migration Assistant, Database Migration Assistant, and I specialize on online migration.
Hey folks, I'm Abhishek Hemrajani. I lead the product team for Azure Migrate. I think I've seen some folks in my session yesterday, so happy to talk to you guys about anything related to what we're doing with Migrate, with infrastructure and application discovery, server migration, and modernization. Happy to be here.
All right, afternoon everybody. My name is Rowan Daly. I'm a technical specialist in Azure, focusing on helping customers like yourself migrate workloads from on-prem to the cloud, and helping you sort out or plan your migration journey.
Hey everybody, my name is Jason Beck. I'm an engineer on the Fast Track for Azure team. We're a team that helps customers migrate and build new solutions in the cloud. So my specialty is in the infrastructure space, so I do a lot of server migrations, big emphasis on the networking, compute, and storage.
Hi, my name is Peter Piper. I'm also on the Fast Track for Azure engineering team, focused on the infrastructure, specializing with compute, DevSecOps, and the cloud adoption framework.
Great, thank you so much. And Ron, do you want to get us started with our short presentation?
Absolutely.
Thanks so much.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about planning your migration journey. Well, we did all the introductions already, so how many folks here are starting to look at migrating workloads to the cloud? Okay, quite a few persons are on that journey already. So what I want to talk to you about just for a few moments is getting started on migrating workload to the cloud. And some of the things that I have seen, the team that I've worked on, we have focused a lot on helping customers, as I said, start on that journey of migrating those workloads, whatever workloads you have running in your environment to the cloud. Now, when we start on that journey, or the conversations that we have with customers, some of the similar things always come online. How do I start? Are there any tools that are better for migrating to the cloud? Does Microsoft has a process, a framework to help me migrate to the cloud? I can't understand, or I don't know where my workloads are. How can I understand what are the makeup of some of my core applications? What applications do we start with first? So, as I always say to customers in our conversation, going to the cloud is not a destination, but it's a journey. And we have different tools, different processes, and different frameworks to help you along that process when you're looking to start your migration. So one of the first things that we talk about, and you might have heard during the course of this week, the cloud adoption framework. And it's really a framework or a methodology around looking at your plan to migrate to the cloud and giving you prescriptive guidance around how you can start to look at setting up your environment and defining the ways and solutions that you want to run in the cloud and understand your governance and compliance model. So we talk about migrating to Azure and being ready to migrate that workload, migrate your workload. The smart paper and smart tooling is a subset that sits on the cloud adoption framework. And in that, there are 9 dimensions that will help you to focus or align correctly in preparation for that migration. And I want to spend a few minutes to just quickly walk through them so that you can understand some of the things that you need to consider when you're thinking about, migrating or starting a migration project in your environment. So the first thing that you want to consider is business justification, or a strategy around how do I, start to even consider the process of migrating. Because a lot of times we think about migration as an IT-driven effort, right? So an IT guy comes in and, I went to Ignite and I saw the coolest things in Azure, and I come back and I want to start migrating my workloads. But the key thing here is helping you to ensure that you align properly with from a business perspective with your stakeholders to ensure that there's a clear reason and there's a clear strategy for migrating those workloads or applications that you want to migrate. Now, the next thing is defining a migration project plan. And there are multiple things that feed into a project plan. And this is more than starting Microsoft project or any project solution. It is a holistic understanding of, one, what are at least a high-level vision on the applications that I need to migrate, the complexity, making prioritization around those applications, and having that written down and defined as to the next step and the process that we're going to engage on in a migration project. Key to also migrating your workloads is also having the right people to help you migrate. Sometimes you do not necessarily have all the capabilities in-house. And we have expert MSP or expert migration partners that are there to help you along that migration journey, because they're doing your core IT job on a day-to-day basis. But you also want to ensure that when you're migrating, you're following best practices, and you have people along that journey with you who have done this before to ensure that you don't run into any mishaps when you're migrating. So after you've looked at your business strategy, we kind of define a high-level project plan, and also looked at working with a partner. The next thing you want to do is focus on application discovery and assessment. Now, what is this? Because I said you need to do a high-level understanding of the applications that you want to migrate. But then when we talk about application discovery and assessment, now we're going to begin to do a more deep assessment or visualization of what my workloads are and whether or not they can actually migrate it to the cloud. Now, this involves tooling, and we have both first-party tools and also some very good third-party or ISV tools that can help you with that assessment. So now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to run an assessment looking at my workloads, whether they're virtual or physical, and then make a decision whether or not these applications can be migrated to the cloud. The assessment will also help me to know the methodology behind which I'm going to migrate those applications. And you might have heard, different views on this, whether I'm going to rehost, I'm going to re-architect, I'm going to refactor, or I'm going to completely rebuild on the cloud. These are decisions that you have to make when you look on your application stack that you're looking to migrate. Now, again, once we have had those things defined and laid down, then there's a process of actually migrating. This is where we start to look at doing some of the actual heavy lifting. How am I going to take those applications that I have prioritized, that I have assessed, and I understand what they are, I understand their dependency, and then start the process of migrating those applications to the cloud. So along that migration process, you want to start with a small application. Some non-production application that is maybe monolithic that can be easily migrated to get your hands, wet, so to speak, to understand how I can use some tooling to migrate that application over into the cloud. And what you do along that migration wave or that migration process is to take the learnings along that line. As you have migrated an application, you understand how the tooling functions around migrating, and you also take those lessons learned forward to move into the next wave of migration. So, if you work with, for example, project managers, they like this process of progressive elaboration. Over time, take those learnings, take those dependencies, and apply them forward so that your next migration wave is better than the one before. Now, importantly, along your migration process is to make sure that your teams have the technical capabilities to actually do the migration, right? But that's just one piece of it. Because Azure, there are so many services and solutions in the cloud. You want to ensure that as you move forward, your team is fully aware of all the capabilities that is available in the cloud. So that is making it in Azure. So that makes sure not only do they understand the migration tool, but as you start to look at services around network management, cost management, infrastructure management, and monitoring, your core people have the necessary skills that will enable them to function in this new cloud model. And for example, you might hear during the course of the week that one of the things that we're doing, we're heavily focused around skilling. And you'll hear things about, for example, the Azure fundamentals training that helps folks to be able to understand or learn more about our Azure platform. Now, with all that said, one of the things you want to do when you start creating or setting up your environment is making sure that you create a landing zone. So this is create a scaffolding to ensure that when I begin to migrate, I'm migrating into a well-managed environment. So my networking is well laid out. My identity model is well laid out. My security and monitoring is laid out. So I ensure whatever compliance standard that I have on-prem, I'm making sure that standard is maintained when I'm in the cloud. And this is a key piece, because if you're going to make sure that you're aligning with your business and having them comfortable with that migration strategy, one of the things you want to make sure is that that foundation or that framework is well laid out before you start migrating those workloads. And then from the operating and security and compliance point of view, again, what you're ensuring is that when you're in this run state is that you can sufficiently function, run the business as it was previously, as when your workloads are on-prem, and align with the compliance and standard operating procedures that were available or in place for your on-prem environment. So that's from a framework point of view. And I just want to quickly move to the next two slides so that I'm not taking out too much time from the panel. But once we have laid out that framework, one of the key things that we have to talk about is, do we have the tooling to make sure that I can migrate those workloads? So some folks might have been familiar with using, for example, Azure Site Recovery to migrate workloads to the cloud. Now that's a DR solution that will facilitate the migrating workloads to Azure. But what we have done is created a holistic experience called the Azure Migrate Hub that allows you to be able to manage all your migration scenarios. And if you look carefully at what we're presenting here, it's not only the ability to migrate servers, but you notice, let's say, for example, you have a VDI infrastructure, from that migration hub, you can start the migration of that VDI environment. Also, your web applications, also databases and stuff like that. And you'll hear the panel talk about those scenarios in a few. So finally, we talk about framework, we talk about tooling. But what we have done is also make sure we can give you an offering, a programmatic view to take this forward, take the migration forward in your environment. And what is that? If you go to AMP, AMP is a program to help you and customers like yourself migrate. So that includes prescriptive guidance, that includes examples, that includes the ability to access resources internally from Microsoft and our partners that can help you to migrate and make sure as you go along that journey, you have the support that you need to be successful when you get into the cloud.
Thanks, John. Natasha, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, sure. I'm so sorry for being late, first of all. I did not plan my time well when I was running from the other building.
I'm sure everyone has had this experience.
I'm Natasha. I'm an engineering manager on the Azure App Services, Functions, Logic Apps team. And we now have, I'm sure you've seen already, web apps integrated to Azure Migrate Hub. I'm happy to answer any questions related to that.
Great, thank you. I should introduce myself. I actually realized I hadn't. Hi, I'm Lindsay Berg. I'm a director of product marketing, also responsible for migration and working closely with Anand. Where we'd like to start today is to talk a little bit about the process of migration. And so we have some areas that we're sort of used to covering. I wonder if anyone on the panel would like to talk about what are some common applications or starting places. Ron addressed this initially, saying we might want to find a simpler application to start with. Does anyone have some examples of great places they've seen customers start?
Yeah, I can take a shot at it, and then the others are welcome to add. there are two ways I've seen customers think about the problem of where do I start or what is the first workload that I should go with. The first approach that I've seen customers say is, hey, let me pick the lowest hanging fruit, right? Something that is relatively achievable and simple. At the other extreme, I've also seen customers say, gosh, you know what, I'm going to pick the most difficult one so that if we do this, then everything else is easy, right? So I've seen both of these approaches. And based on all my discussions and my own experience, I, of course, recommend the former. Because what you can do as IT is pick something that is achievable. It allows you to rope your application or platform owners along for the ride. And what we've seen in many cases is migrations get stalled because your application counterparts or business counterparts may not be fully aligned. They might be worried about, oh my God, would something break? So selecting something that is doable and giving them a taste of the cloud lifestyle and showing them how it's possible to do things much quicker. Like I've seen a real example where a customer, ultimately, found a way to convince their application owners to move their app to the cloud. And then the app owner told the IT person, hey, I want to scale up in a week's time. And then the person just got on the phone and said, I can do it right away, Mr. Application Owner. And the person at the other end of the phone was shocked. And they asked how? Because we've got things like VM scale sets, and I can just dial up some of these things on Azure, and it happens immediately, right? So those people were shocked, the application people, as to what's possible. So that's an example of finding the right partners in the business and the application side to support you, pick the right first workload, build confidence, success begets success. So I would kind of go with the approach of picking something more achievable.
Does anyone else have comments on places you've seen people start? Yeah?
Yeah, I can expand a little bit. To even keep going on the, picking workloads that are achievable and thinking about picking candidate applications that are potentially lower hanging fruit, but things that are also high value. So just because something is low hanging fruit, it doesn't mean it's an unimportant application, whether it's some sort of internal application, but it's critical to the business. And if it represents a similar application architecture that is adopted within the organization, it could be a good pattern to say, hey, we migrated these handful of applications. We determined that there were low-hanging fruits. So we had a high idea of success, but it was a great value for the business from like a learning perspective from the people who did the actual migration, but then the end users can say, this application is now in Azure, it works great, and it can spread the word of the migration as well.
What about lift and shift versus actually moving something to a fully managed service, as you might do with Logic Apps? Do you have comments on, is it better to start with a lift and shift project, or do you want to see some of that value in a fully managed service, as we sometimes do with like SQL DB? Anyone?
Well, I think it all depends, right? Because especially with lift and shift, a lot of times, where we see that becomes urgent is where customers have these expiring data center contracts that they need to go quickly, right? So it's kind of the easiest way to get folks in the cloud, versus a customer that is, has some experience with the cloud previously, and they have some, cloud native applications. So taking those workloads and refactoring them and moving them to PaaS services is a little bit easier for that environment. But usually when, it's time, that contract is expiring and I need to go, lift and shift is the easy conversation.
Yeah.
I think in web apps business, so far we've seen actually one thing, hopefully you guys would know, but one thing we have seen with some customers is you can move your traditional IaaS applications without so much as a configuration change and move it to Azure App Service without actually refactoring or touching the code at all. I know it's not considered traditional lift and shift because you are moving an app running on IaaS, in this case an IaaS server, to a PaaS offering, but really it is as simple as that. We've seen about 20% of apps that are being assessed in Web App Migration Assistant today are eligible for lift and shift and are able to just move with some configuration changes. And those configuration changes are, I think, to an earlier point, really on-prem to cloud-native decision points. So for example, you would, because you can, on an IaaS server, be running an application on a non-AT port. You don't have that ability because we don't let you configure ports on a PaaS app service, for example. It's examples like that that you would need to change your configuration. But for most cases, with IaaS applications at least, we have seen it is not that hard to lift and shift the applications. It's worth assessing to see what are those low-hanging fruits that are good candidates. And even for the ones that aren't, we have many options. You can just move the VM first, modernize later, or if you're ready, just write the code in the latest cloud-native technologies.
Yeah, if I may quickly add to that, what you want to do is, as you're looking through your estate, you want to take a macro approach to what's going to be a candidate for lift and shift and what's going to be a candidate for you to start thinking about a more app-oriented approach.
Yeah.
So the way we like to think of it is you want to take an infrastructure pivot to a set of applications that have urgent needs. Rowan spoke about urgent capacity needs, or if the app is coming up for a software or a hardware refresh, that's a great candidate to quickly bring to the cloud. It could go to Azure Infrastructure Service, it could go to Azure App Service, whatever quickest lift and shift approach may be relevant. But then there are also a set of apps that are truly candidates for innovation. These are apps that you're actively coding against. You have a warm DevOps pipeline already going. Those are great candidates for immediately starting to consider modernization. And quite frankly, there was the year before or even the year before that, we always thought of it as start with rehost and then figure out how you're going to modernize. We are seeing customers get so mature, the migration business getting so mature that customers of all sizes are in parallel executing these paths. They're going through very carefully doing discovery and analysis and figuring out which apps meet which treatment criteria and executing them at the same time.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note that particularly in the regulated industries where it's fundamentally easier to build new in the cloud than it is to move something that you already have compliant on premises, building new in the cloud actually can be the best starting place, just because then you're not working with an older application infrastructure that may be compliant across a multitude of different dimensions.
Yeah.
When you think about cultural factors, and I think Rowan touched a little bit on this, and certainly Anant did, how are you seeing customers be most successful? How do you get the alliance with the app owner or the business owner to make those changes?
Yeah, I'll take a start at that. We talk a lot about technology. All of us are technology expert, but that's really not the rub here. It's really the human alignment piece. At least that's been one of the aha moments for us along this journey. If you think about it fundamentally, right, the language or the vocabulary of cloud is different, right? So people on-premise environments, you talk about servers, storage, networks. When they go to Azure, they're talking about two things, a subscription and a bill, right? So you kind of fundamentally change the vocabulary on people, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. We've seen customers do a few interesting things, though. The first tactic that I've seen is a lot of customers establish a clear center of gravity. Like we were working with Chevron, for example. They established a Tiger team who were chartered to be trailblazers, right? Show us the way, right? They actually gathered people from the business, the application or the platform side, and the IT side, and they actually had them work together to sort of form that inner circle, and they actually established a set of great processes and standards and guardrails and pipelines, all of those things, and then they rolled it out broadly, right? That was a great example of everyone coming together. I've seen that work pretty well in general. And then the other thing is just the whole notion of making sure that you have a clear handshake at all levels of the organization, ranging from the CXO's office down to the application owners and the IT people. And there is a constant checkpoint across all of those constituencies to make sure you're tracking to your migration plan and progress.
If you don't mind me adding, the cultural aspect with a DevSecOps mindset, shift left, shift right, and ask me any questions after the fact about any of those, it allows the collaboration and the intent to move to a much more automated process from infrastructure as code using different tool chain within Azure. So that becomes one part of the communication thread is how do I provide an automation process to adhere to compliance?
Yeah. Do we have any questions from the audience on this particular topic on getting started or the process that you might use? Otherwise, I'm going to keep going.
If you don't mind, I might add just one more thought on that.
Sure.
The one thing which we've also learned in a lot of cases is that people's motivation or adaptability to change is also a function of their competence, right? A lot of times, just training people, right? Training all your IT people, training all your devs, training all your architects, and creating that baseline level of awareness and making it approachable, frankly. And I took the Azure Fundamentals course. It took me 4 hours. Fine, I'm steeped in Azure. It wasn't too long. Maybe it takes 6 hours for people or 7 hours, but it's possible. It's doable. We all got a day off to do that, right? So do that, right? It's fine. The amount that will pay you back when you go back to your application teams and your business teams is manifold. So I just wanted to offer that practical tip as well.
Yeah, if I may quickly add, I think that's such an important point. I think a lot of conversations go about, oh, this team is very pro Azure or this team is very pro AWS. I think as IT people, like people who work in engineering, we should be only pro knowledge. I think it's only in our interest to know about stuff. I work on Azure, but I know what happens in AWS because I need to skill up and I need to be current with everything that's happening out there. And there's so much that's happening that if you keep pushing off the actual process of learning, it only harms us as our profiles and careers. So I think it's in the interest of everyone to just know what's out there.
Great. Any other final comments on that initial process of selecting workloads or how you get started or in that area? Or shall we move on and talk a little bit about the technology? Great. All right. Well, absolutely. Let's look at what are some of the common errors that you've seen in choosing a tool set or in choosing the way that you approach using tools for migration. Rowan, do you want to start? You're nodding enthusiastically.
Oh boy, where do I start? First of all, I think even before we start with the migration tooling, right? So the actual migration. Yeah. I think it's important to choose the right tooling for assessment, right? So a lot of customers that we have worked with, one of the big challenges, they really don't understand their landscape, right? Some folks manage their landscape from an Excel spreadsheet, some IP addresses, a server name, and there are others who have a mature CMDB. But a lot of the times there is a lack of understanding as to what's in my environment, how is it connected, how is it documented and stuff like that. So you want to make sure from that perspective you have a tooling that allows you, or a set of tools that allows you to get that deep insight into your infrastructure. Because again, we're not just moving boxes, we're moving applications, we're moving business critical resources. And you can only execute successfully if you understand clearly, what is the makeup of those applications, what are the priority, what is the pattern of the usage of that application, and how it affects your users within the infrastructure. So I think that's a key piece, a key conversation. What is the application? What am I looking to move? And will the tooling that I'm looking to move support the environment that I'm looking to move? If I have an environment that is heavily physical machines, right, which tool supports that, right, for example?
Anybody else? Sure.
Also, what I have seen is you should know your stakeholders. Sometimes a DBA start migrating a database, but does not know who is handling Azure networking, for example. So I have seen mistakes there. You can't connect from database migration service back to your database. So knowing your stakeholders, knowing who are the key knowledge holders is also important.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I can take that. I think, in terms of errors as you onboard to tooling, those happen all the time, and people can usually navigate through those. If you're using Azure Migrate, for example, as you're getting started, Azure Migrate uses an approach where we don't make you to make all of your virtual machines talk to Azure. We let you install an appliance in your on-premises environment. That appliance does need to talk to Azure. And you'd be surprised, the most common, or maybe not surprised, the most common issue that customers run into is that that appliance is not able to talk to the internet. Right. Well, Azure is only reachable via the internet. And as commonplace as it may seem, that happens all the time. So figuring out that, do you have network connectivity? Does your firewall at least allow outbound connection from that one tiny little appliance that needs to talk to Azure, but can do such an important activity, which is discovery of your entire estate? Figuring out those kind of things can be problematic. What usually will happen is that the IT admin or the IT pro sits down to start performing the discovery and assessment, but does not have the right privilege on her or his account on his Azure subscription to be even initiate that first registration. Those kind of things that happen specifically to tools and in general in any kind of hybrid scenario with Azure that often get overlooked.
Absolutely. We have a question from the audience.
Yes, it's a comment, and it's specifically addressing what was just mentioned, the previous speaker, stakeholders. What I see with my customers in Latin America is that oftentimes the stakeholders are not only the technology people, I think even before that are the business people.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And they need to have clarity not only of which apps can go to the cloud if it's a migration or modernization scenario, but what is the level of risk if something goes bad?
Yeah.
And am I going to make money or lose money? Yeah. So the point that I'm trying to make, yes, I mean, stakeholders and more than just those of us that work in technology, it's actually a big part of that is the business stakeholders. Yeah. And a comment that was made, I think, in the previous question in terms of training, what I see other companies doing, other cloud providers, they're doing a good job in training more than just technical roles. They're training finance, they're training business, because I think everyone needs to develop this new vocabulary of what cloud technologies are all about. Yeah. Not only in the context of how I use them or how I implement them, actually how do I procure them, how much are they going to cost, and all those kinds of things. So just 2 cents. Thank you.
Amazing.
Can I jump on this
Please.
one? For me, from the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework, from your strategy to planning to readiness to adopt, and then your operate. But there's one area, it's organize. Understanding people, their roles and responsibilities as you evolve into the Microsoft Azure platform. And so the RACI matrix, responsible, accountable, consult, or inform. So, and there are spreadsheets, there's tooling around the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework to help you build that vocabulary, to understand how you move from one phase to the next phase through your journey.
No, that's true, and that again, so I guess a follow-up comment is that oftentimes what we see even as sellers of services and technologies is that we're focusing on one project and not unnecessarily landing CAF, right?
Right.
And when that doesn't happen, then we start seeing issues here and there, and some of them become actually quite serious.
So that's why the strategy conversation is so important, right? Because you're not just looking, as you said, this single application that we're looking to migrate or whatever. We're really supposed to be focusing on, from a business point of view, how does this company, how does this organization adopt cloud from a technology point of view, but across the landscape of that customer, right? And consultants or like yourself, I think the cloud adoption framework helps you to drive that with our customers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and to his point though, I think the scenario continues to be somewhat underserved, right? If you're being honest about it, your financial controller does not really have an experience in most public clouds, right?
Yeah.
I mean, where do I go as a person from finance or business to figure out, is this cloud actually saving me money 5 years down the road? But what I can offer as a suggestion though is, in Azure Migrate, we have a tool that's already integrated. It's called Unify Cloud. You may have used it before or heard about them. They have fantastic calculations on what the present value of your cloud transformation is going to be, or at what point does your cash flow become positive. So as you're performing infrastructure discovery and analysis, you also get very detailed visualizations on how are you going to do long-term in terms of cost, and at what point will you actually transition into that value from having that transformation go through. Those are great scenarios that I think are starting to get solved, but need to get solved more seriously so that the financial controller also onboards to Azure, not just the IT pro or the developer.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Yeah, we've definitely seen situations where companies were transitioning from significant CapEx to increasing capacity in Azure, which becomes OpEx, and their controller was quite startled. So that's really an important area to consider as you're shifting from a model where you're buying servers to a model where you're buying capacity. Do you have a question?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say I totally 150 million% agree with you with the fact that those that are in charge of the financial aspects are not well versed in technology, and that usually is a barrier. But I have a technical question. You mentioned I was one of the lucky ones that attended your session, And regarding the appliance, I have certain customers that are basically segregated to internal zones, secure zones, and we're not just talking networking, but basically policies and strategies and their philosophy of, and the laws and regulations of that municipality. Can you, I haven't come across any limitations regarding the appliances. Can you have a multitude of appliances? Is there to perform the same migration?
Yeah, you can. Basically, the same project can support as many appliances that are registered to it. The trick is going to be on how much segregation do you need between the data that's being discovered by the different appliance. For example, if you are dealing with multiple customers, multiple municipalities, you're bringing them into your own subscription because you want to own the metadata, or you've provided the subscription, you still potentially want to ensure that their metadata remains isolated from each other. So what you do is every time you create a project, you use a different resource group in Azure. That way, you have control, but the customer's data does not intermix. But you can have as many appliances talking to one project or as many projects in your subscription that you choose to. So long as they're uniquely named, you're fine.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
Ron,
and I'm glad you attended the session yesterday.
Ron, I want to come back to something you said a little while ago about not just looking at application dependencies, but also at usage patterns. Can you clarify why you think that's important as part of migration? Because I think it's something we don't discuss enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Usage patterns in the sense of your change rate, your churn pattern on your application. Because, for example, a common scenario, right? We go to migrate databases, right? We have these, a lot of customers, they're trying to optimize, I'll use the word optimize their SQL licensing, so all their databases are dumped on, one box. So it's heavily utilized, and so you need to find the best way. You need to find the most optimal way of migrating that SQL database, right? Maybe based on the change pattern on that database, maybe Azure Migrate might not be your best solution. You might look at something as DMS to start the migration process of migrating that database to SQL MI or even a SQL PAS, as the case may be. But the idea is that really, when you look at your applications that you're migrating, you want to over an extended period of time, a long enough period of time, understand what the change pattern of that application is, so that I will match it with I'm right-sizing it for compute in Azure, right? And Azure Migrate allows you to do that. That's built into the tool natively. Because generally, as I like to say in my presentations, when I go into a customer and I say to an application owner, when you want to create a VM and your IT guy says to you, what size VM do you want? The answer is usually, give me as big as you have, right? So most environments are over-provisioned. So you don't want to necessarily migrate like for like, into Azure. You want to make sure, or into the cloud, you want to ensure that you're looking at your application patterns and right-sizing that workload, when you migrate that workload into the cloud.
And to kind of expand on that even more, if some of the app teams are saying, why should I be right-sizing? This is going to be part of kind of some of the cost conversation of on-prem, if you shut down the server, the cost saving is not as comparable as when you're in an OpEx model, where if you right-size a little bit, your overall total cost of ownership can go down. So just to kind of reinforce some of the points there.
Great. Anything else with the tooling that you think is particularly important for data? Are there key things that you look for when you're doing data migration?
Yeah, I mean, we have a whole process. You should make sure you go through the data migration guide. You go through each phase and assess your source and targets that you want to migrate to. And like I said, some of the common mistakes is not having the right resources available for networking, for even for subscriptions and stuff, permissions, those kinds of issues.
So we've talked a little bit then more about the process of getting there. We often discuss the importance of getting your landing zone right. So it's not just a matter of looking at what you're moving, it's a process of looking at the house you're moving into. So can you talk a little bit more about this concept of an appropriately built landing zone? And really, what are some do's and don'ts for that? I don't know who wants to start.
Yeah, I can kind of kick it off, because I think a lot of topics typically are involved with the landing zone, so I can kind of touch on a few and let some others jump in. So typically when I start thinking about a landing zone in Azure, that's really kind of the scaffold that is really kind of built around like the house for everything else that will come inside, which will be the applications. So a couple things that I like to think of kind of up front are, thinking about the identity and thinking about your networking, kind of from like a little bit from like a technical perspective. So when I think about the identity, it's really about using Azure Active Directory and connecting that back down with your existing Active Directory. So when you want to think about protecting your users when they access Azure, when they log into the portal, they're using their same account that they might use for Office 365. So it should be a seamless experience, and you can apply those policies to use things like multi-factor authentication. So getting that set up kind of up front, if you're already using Office 365, that means you're already using Azure Active Directory, and so you might have already gone past that. But once you get all that set up, then you can start looking at some of the identity things specific for Azure. Things can even go a little bit deeper, going into things for SAML and building things specifically for your applications. But I would say that's where you might want to, you can hold off a little bit, because I think the landing zone is really getting kind of the infrastructure side of the identity taken care of. When I look at the networking as well, this is really about connectivity up to Azure. When we think about moving applications to the cloud, we don't think that you're going to move your entire business to the cloud and you're going to get rid of all of your on-premises data centers. We really think about it as a hybrid story. And we really think that there will be things that will probably stay on-premises, and there will be many things that will be migrated to the cloud and built to the cloud, built natively in the cloud. So thinking about the network is something that you want to do some very good planning. It's one of the things that once you implement it, it's something that you typically don't want to change very often. So it's one of the great things if you kind of do a lot of homework and get some, follow some of our reference architectures that are in the Cloud Adoption Framework. We have already kind of shared some of the best practices of things that will be very secure, things that will align to certain compliance, and things that will scale very well. Some of the key things here is overall, when you scale, you want to make sure that you can maintain everything. So I think when you kind of step away from the identity and the management, kind of the governance is one of the big things that I kind of want to keep thinking about. And that really plays into it a lot of different areas in terms of, can I govern and manage my identity? Can I govern and manage my network? How about when I start moving applications, do I have a good story on monitoring? For servers, do I have a good story for patching, and is it consistent? And so these are kind of the first things that I like to think of when even kind of approaching kind of the landing zone conversation.
And I definitely want more people to come on that one. But I should say also, we do have someone in the room with a large stack of books on the Cloud Adoption Framework. So if you want more information, or just outside, just in the back. So if you do, as you're leaving, if you are interested in a copy of our Cloud Adoption Framework book, we highly recommend it. Anybody else want to talk a little bit about the setting up of a landing zone, some of the topics that we're thinking about: identity, governance, networking?
I can add one comment on the management portion of it. How many of you folks use tools like System Center, Operations Manager on premises? Can I see a few show of hands? Yeah, a lot of you. Yeah, so when you're moving your apps, data, or infrastructure to Azure, a lot of you ask us, hey, I've like heavily configured my management packs to work on premises. Should I throw that all away and adopt your Azure management tools, or what should I do, right? That's always the typical question that comes up. So, our response has been, it's really possible. If you feel like you're really passionate about your management packs and just cannot let them go, it's fine. You can actually deploy Operations Manager in an Azure VM as well, right? And carry over all those configurations. We've seen a lot of customers do that. We've actually published docs that actually specify how you want to do that without losing your IP, if you will, that you've accumulated over the years, right? We do believe a lot of, we do believe that it's pretty easy to sort of add on backup or monitoring and security intelligence through the built-in Azure capabilities. And we do encourage a lot of customers to adopt those Azure native capabilities, right? Because they are built into the platform. In many cases, it's turned on pretty quickly. But we totally understand that you've got a lot of accumulated knowledge in your on-premises investments, and you don't want that to go away. So yes, feel free to find the right transition path to move that IP to Azure, and then over time start hydrating that IP into the native Azure capabilities and tool sets as well, and then adopt the native tool sets over time. That's my 2 cents in my experience there.
Yeah, I'll add something that I think, it's sometimes I see it's overlooked, and it's resource management. When you start, deploying to the cloud. Just simple thing like naming standards, right? Ensuring consistency in naming standard. Ensure, for example, if you're tagging your resources, to the right cost center and to the right owners. I think those are significant simple things that, if done properly, helps with the adoption, out early.
Yeah, great. Can we start? I don't know who was first.
Cost planning, tools that you used in the beginning to estimate what things were going to cost. After getting there, what you used to report on costs. Budgeting, how you budget for devs to decide, hey, what they can spin up and spend. And finally, cost alerting, where things get out of hand and someone gets involved.
Azure Cost Management does all of it. So if you've used, so Azure Cost Management came out of our acquisition of Cloudin. And if you've looked at the latest version in the Azure portal, you can figure out scenarios like once you have deployed to the cloud. So pre-cloud migration, you are using TCO calculator and the cost planning features in Azure Migrate. But once your workloads are running, or even if you have born in the cloud workloads, cost management will tell you exactly how you are incurring consumption per subscription, or even based on who's actually consuming. You can set quotas and allocation against certain people, certain subscriptions, so that if you have a dev test subscription, it does not go beyond a certain usage. And then combined with advisors, you can even figure out where you may be accidentally leaving resources running and jacking up the actual end of month consumption that you may end up incurring. So those features exist between advisors and cost management. You can potentially solve the scenarios that you just mentioned.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of quick things. One is I'll fully acknowledge what you just asked, because I've actually seen real customer migration projects get stalled for the reason that they had a chargeback model which was more optimized for on-premises environments, and they were looking to move to the cloud. And at that point, all of the departments, right, and the CF and the controllers, they need to work together to figure out the right chargeback model, and they struggle to get that right. Now, there are features like Azure Cost Management. There is also policy, right? You can actually enforce, in your example, if you're worried about a developer using the wrong SKU or leaving it on when they go home for the weekend, you can enforce all of that in policy to build onto the Azure Cost Management example. But I really feel that this is a huge topic. There are features that can help you there, but I think just making sure that the process of planning and budgeting, I think that you spoke about, is also agreed on with the with the CFO's office down to all of the application owners, the platform owners, and you guys, if you're in central IT, is as important. And that may not be accomplished fully by the tools and capabilities we offer, and we do acknowledge that as well.
Right, and that's, were there any third-party tools that you feel like you rely on for success, maybe like a Cloud Health, Turbonomics, somebody out there that helps you manage the costs and report upon them, especially when reporting is so important, and IT is not usually used to being a cost accountant?
Yeah, to be fair, I mean, building on Abhishek's point, the integration with Turbonomics, we have that. We actually have that built into the Azure Migrate tool, funnily enough. All the reporting, all the beautiful dashboards that Turbonomics has, we've integrated that work. I'm just acknowledging the fact that there is work that needs to happen even outside the tool sets and getting all the humans aligned on the business process around chargeback and reporting. And then you use the tools to meet the things that you've agreed on with your stakeholders.
Yeah, though, what he's saying, the Turbonomic integration that we have in Migrate is pre-migration cost planning. What he's talking about is the ongoing Azure cost management, where Turbonomic, by the way, you're right, has a very good scenario, and they do have some good capabilities in there. So maybe worth exploring.
And then one more thing to add in terms of sometimes the audience is not always, from the reporting perspective, could be more at an executive level. And I know from the cost management side, we have updated kind of the Power BI dashboard template that comes with cost management. So I think that came out, I think, a couple weeks ago, which might be more of an executive viewpoint, maybe compared to like a day-to-day operations.
Yeah. Thank you.
My next question.
Yes. So going back to how you get started in the migration, I work for a very large enterprise, and we're a federated business model, and say we had an acquisition that had a tenant, and they wanted to remarket themselves, and we migrated. They wanted to be, our business decided that they wanted to be migrated to a new tenant with a new domain name. But me as a senior engineer, obviously wanted to give them the ability to have a good end user experience and not utilize two sets of credentials. Well, I didn't have that opportunity. So would it be fair to say that my company would need to decide to use Azure AD Connect and get that set up first before I can provide my end users a good experience?
I can start with this one. So typically whenever we see some of those kind of like integrations, it is going to be key on the identity perspective. A lot of this will go into a lot of details in terms of like where those domains sit today, if there's any trust between them, if you can bring one into the other, and then somehow, like depending if they both have Azure AD.
So that's what we do first is we bring them into one static domain.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no Azure AD Connect. I mean, basically, I end up having to do just mail enabled Office 365 for that tenant, so they have to use 2 forms of authentication.
Okay.
Yes. Would it be safe to say that you need to use Azure AD Connect to give the end user a better experience?
Correct, yeah. So I would say Azure AD Connect is going to be key to this, and there are this gets pretty specific. There are some things in the documentation that will help you in terms of if you have mail-enabled accounts and if you use Azure AD Connect, how do you, when you sync the identity that already exists, to use an existing one rather than overriding the information. So very detailed, but those processes exist because those scenarios do happen, yes.
We do have 30-minute one-on-one sessions in the fast track for Azure. So if you want to kind of just deep dive on that, we could definitely do that. It's by appointment, so if your schedule allows.
Yeah, I checked the appointments. They look like they're all booked up, so.
You can just come for walk-ups.
There's Wednesdays and Thursdays. We're still, so
There was a session today on exactly that, handling boundaries across tenancies.
Mhm.
And that's the ADM 50, so you can probably view the feedback,
the video.
ADM 50, you said, the session?
Yeah, I think it is.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else that you want to bring up in terms of the landing zone? Anything else anything you feel like we've missed?
So there's one thing in the cloud adoption framework. There's one of the tools is Azure Blueprints, and there are samples pre-built and available. And one of them is a cloud adoption framework blueprint, and then another is a cloud adoption framework with a landing zone. There are other ones with shared services, if you have NIST compliance, PCI compliance, et cetera. But it does provision your network, your virtual network, an initial subnet, various components, key vault, et cetera. So definitely take a look at that. And then if you're not familiar with it, create a test subscription, see what that looks like, and then start incorporating that, and then build your blueprint as you mature in your cloud journey.
Great. So can we then talk a little bit about...
I have a question.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Thank you.
Hi. So my question is around migration of vendor apps. We've been very successful with our custom apps. We've moved a lot of web apps to application services. So we've seen the efficiencies and we know how to do it. But now we're starting to deal with our vendor apps, which is a significant portion of our portfolio. And the notion of modernization is very difficult for us, right? Other than rehosting it really and maybe right-sizing.
Yep.
How do we think of modernization? I guess I'm just asking for your experience and your thoughts on what does it really mean to migrate a vendor app which you don't own the code for. You know, some of those don't have APIs. They're truly not really modern. And how can we really harness the power of Azure if in those scenarios?
Do you know what kind of frameworks those apps are using, or not even?
A wide range of those. Some of those are really old, and you know, we have 3 tiers. In some cases, it's really just a database that we can move, and it has a thick client. So all sorts, but it's really, we don't really own the code. We can't really do much. So again, just looking for your thoughts on how to think about migrating those and making them efficient.
Yeah, I think I can take a kind of a first take on this. So very common to see a lot of vendor software or third-party software that you can't touch or change. For a lot of the software, typically we see a lot of organizations see if that company has a SaaS solution to replace that. Rather than trying to go into a model of how can we finagle this to make it work exactly the same way as it does on premises, you're just keeping that same, maybe legacy, maybe not legacy. Third-party software running exactly as is in an on-prem model might not be optimized for the cloud. So a lot of organizations will provide a SaaS solution. I'd say that's maybe the best opportunity. If that doesn't happen, it is pretty common for, SaaS might not be the right option for how that tool works. they sometimes have platform solutions or they have integrated cloud solutions where maybe if you go to the Azure Marketplace and you're trying to deploy something, we might already have it available, and there might just be specific configuration that you might have to deploy along with that to achieve the same thing. So that would be more cloud aware, might not be deployed in an on-prem model. So you might, rather than migrating it, you might redeploy and something like that. And so typically for many of the things that we continue to see used, those are the most common paths. SaaS is obviously a little bit more preferable. There's less management on your side, but obviously that's not possible in all circumstances. So PaaS or maybe just an IaaS solution that is just tailored for the cloud is also great.
Yeah, I mean, we internally at Microsoft, we've run into the same problem as that, and there are a couple of examples I can provide where we were actually able to work with that vendor and help them SaaSify their solution. It turned out that we also had a good partnership with them. It was SAP. So SAP has solutions like SuccessFactors, which automates HR business processes, right? So we took a big dependency on them moving to that modern architecture on Azure as well, right, when we adopted them. That's one example. We also have adopted internally a contract tracking tool called iCertus. You know, again, it's used broadly by other companies as well. Again, a SaaS-based tool. So yeah, I mean, this one is really tough, and a lot of times it takes several customers to keep pushing at the ISV or the commercial off-the-shelf vendor to SaaSify their solution or minimally certify their solution to work in an Azure IaaS-like environment if you can't really work with them to modernize it.
All right, no, that's helpful, thanks. That's how we're thinking about it, really, to challenge the vendors to modernize their app and offer a software as a service or make it more cloud ready.
Yeah, but there are two aspects to it, right? There is the aspect where the vendor may not support, like even if you do decide to do a lift and shift, which continues to be at least my strong recommendation, that you're always going to have this challenge of figuring out the optimal modernization path. The vendor may or may not support it. You are going to have to figure all that out, but lift and shift gets you to the cloud, and if you do a lift shift with optimization and right sizing, then you may already start getting efficient, at least from an infra consumption perspective. So rehost, but then also you could start breaking down the pieces in terms of what patterns can lend themselves to partial modernization. Specifically, say you have a vendor app that's backed by a SQL server, you could still potentially modernize the SQL layer by moving to SQL managed instance, retaining the web and the app on infrastructure as a service VMs. Or if it's running some piece of .NET or PHP, you could use Azure App Service Migration Assistant and move that portion to app service. So while you've not gone through and truly modernized or the entire app, you've taken some components and started moving them to modern platforms, and then you start putting together the story. So there may be different paths to pursue on vendors supporting the software or not in Azure, but then you also want to start figuring out what your strategy is for the data and the web and the app tiers, and figuring out those patterns.
I will add one more. I totally agree with what Abhishek said. You can put the right pressure with vendors, but you might get only so far. If you are able to lift and shift the applications or just the infrastructure on the VMs, please do it. One other thing I have seen more and more customers try, especially for integrated applications, is to potentially move and reconsider things like, we have integration services in Azure. We have logic apps, for example. So you could have connectors that Logic Apps has, which allows you to connect to SAP, which is on-prem, or connect to other on-prem assets via the connectors that are native to Logic Apps. So you can very quickly, it has a visual designer, very quickly modernize your application, but really in a drag and drop fashion, and have a connected experience for things that might be better suited left behind and just connected to from that piece. I think since you have an assortment, you might be doing a little bit of everything we said. But
yeah, in fact, I can give one example, very specific example of what we do internally. Like, we have these payroll apps, right? The pay stub where people go and check their own sort of pay stubs every fortnight. You know, basically that the SAP installation that supports all of our financial payroll runs on premises, right? But then we just built a beautiful Power App on top So it's a very easy, modern way for employees internally around the world at Microsoft to access their pay stubs, right? Although the back-end system still, you don't touch it till we are fully ready to make the move and all of that. But to Natasha's point, it's a beautiful hybrid pattern. And what we did in that example is we were able to retire a bunch of server infrastructure, which was not really adding value. At the end of the day, you just need a SAP-like solution at the back end, and you just use the front end, which is microservices-based, using logic apps or power apps-based, very easy to create. Even the business can do it.
Yeah, and it's cheap.
Kind of solution.
It's consumption-based, so it's pennies.
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
Do we have other audience questions? Are there other things people would like to ask? Please feel free to come up.
We've got a little bit of a problem. We've got an office where we need to do some IT modernization, where we've got a couple of servers which have about 250, 300 terabytes of data, and we want to move them between the US and Europe. So we've got a VPN connection, so it's about 128 meg network connection, and it's about 400 years to move the data from A to B.
Yeah.
We looked at the data box, but the data box you can't send from region to region. It's only, you can only send them locally. What do we do?
US, sorry.
So it's from the US, and it's going to Dublin. So without me going there with the box and the plane.
On-prem in US to Azure.
On-prem in US.
To Azure Dublin.
And Azure Dublin.
Has anybody talked about doing a two-hop approach where you can do like data box into a US region, and then once it's in there, you can copy with Microsoft Backbone to Ireland?
Yes, sort of, but it's that whole.
Can we attempt to solve it for you? If you're willing to reach out to us via email, we should attempt to solve it for you.
But it's a good one, yeah?
Yeah.
That's our account rep said exactly the same thing, and it went through the whole pre-sales, and people just went, we don't know.
It's fantastic you have engineers here. We'll attempt to solve it for you.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah, you shouldn't have to double hop.
Great. Next, please.
So I have a handful of Azure Migrate technical questions. Firstly, is this the right forum for that?
I guess.
Go for it.
Okay.
I mean, I only own the product.
You only do? Okay, so
Let's get started.
first of all, you mentioned the Azure Migrate appliance reaching to the internet.
Yes.
Now, a client concern I've had is there a way to get that is there a best practice to have that replication over my express route and not destroying my data center's internet?
Yes and yes. So actually, before I answer your question, can I take like 1 minute to set the nomenclature context, because I see my co-panelists also use it all over the place. Azure Migrate is just the hub of all things migration in the Azure portal. That's where you go in the portal and discover migration scenarios. The specific scenario that you spoke about is server discovery or infrastructure discovery. That's server assessment within Azure Migrate. The reason I explicitly clarify on that nomenclature is because there is also web app assessment in Azure Migrate. There is also VDI. There is also databases.
Server Migrate.
Server migration. Yes. Perfect. Yes. So server assessment, the appliance that you use for server assessment and server migration, you can control the bandwidth that it uses or the type of network that it uses in two ways. So for example, if you are replicating over public internet and you're worried about impacting your data center, you can configure the Windows squaws policy on the appliance to specify how much bandwidth needs to get used of the total available bandwidth. You can also specify what hours the bandwidth needs to get used. The other option is that you do in fact have express route, and you can configure the replication to go over express route. Over there as well, you can restrict how much of the available express route bandwidth can be used and at what times.
How can I do that?
Using the Windows squaws policy, our documentation has a detailed guidance to do that. We also have my team in the front, and they can point it to the documentation to you if you need it.
Okay. All right, I had one on configuration. If you were able to have any injected steps for, so it's not straight rehost, maybe have that VMware inject a script, like install the Azure agent on these machines using guest operations, so that they're a little more Azure ready. Is there something in the roadmap for that?
So right now with server migration, what we are unfortunately still not doing is we're not placing the the Microsoft Azure agent on the VM. Once we start automatically bundling that, which should happen within a month or so, I'm looking at my team. All
Just
three of
sign them up.
nodded, yeah. So which should happen within a month or so. What you'll be able to do is you'll be able to leverage the script extension framework to basically execute in-guest operations. You can also already basically create your own automation on top of the execution process and do it manually. But then with the agent on there automatically bundled, it will become a lot easier. So it's going to happen.
Okay, and dependency mapping is now the agentless, just went into preview.
Yeah.
So I had a question about, is there any disparity between performance between the agent version or how it works versus agent or agentless? Is there anything missing or added through either one?
Actually, great question. There are two different pieces of tech built by two different teams. So the agent-based version, we were actually borrowing IP from the service map investments that we have, and we were using service map through the Azure Migrate experience. When we decided to build the dependency mapping agentless and decided to build it within our engineering team, what we at least ensured is that the features that customers were already getting with service map, they would get the same features and more. So currently what you have missing in the preview is that in the service map view of the map, you can look at the entire visualization and you can control-click through the nodes and create your group and then compose an assessment on top of the group. In the preview that I announced yesterday, you will not be able to create the group from control-click. You can see everything, and then you would have to manually compose the group and create the assessment. Other than that, I think we're very similar in terms of performance and the data visualization that we have.
Okay, and finally, for just the high-level answer here is automating this whole process. So I can feed it, say, a list of VMs I want to move, click a button, Azure, it's all tagged, everything is happy.
You mean via REST API or PowerShell, or just in general when you use it from the portal?
Just how automatable is the Azure Migrate, entire the suite?
So our PowerShell, we haven't released it as yet. End of this month, we will release the REST API documentation. REST API is already available. We haven't just published the Swagger. We will do that at the end of this month. You can pretty much automate the entire process end to end. I will, however, tell you this. The process of doing the discovery, which is, the way I see it is it's a one-time activity, right? You basically say that I'm going to start today and I have a 20,000 server data center. I'm going to go and discover it and visualize the dependencies, do the assessments. That I still recommend that customers do it directly from the portal because it's a very visual experience. It's not a PowerShell experience. Once they have decided creating the groups, creating and passing the assessment into the migration phase, all of that you can automate.
Any AZ CLI support too, or just PowerShell?
Currently, PowerShell is in the roadmap. I want to get CLI done, but
okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Over here.
Thank you. Great questions.
I'm looking to try to migrate a site that I maintain in 2020. It's a financial services application, and it's very painful for our customers if we have to take an outage. Currently, our SQL database is a HA cluster in Rackspace. Is there guidance around how to minimize downtime when we move the data over? And we'll prep the app, we'll test everything, but when we're finally ready to cut over, you know, there's going to be some level of outage, I'm guessing, with the data.
So database migration service is probably where you should go. And we have what we call online migration, where we do an initial migration and then we keep the data in sync from your source to target until you are ready to cut over. And there are two flavors of it right now. One flavor is if you want to migrate from on-prem to Azure SQL database, that uses one set of technology, or there's another one where you want to migrate from on-prem to managed instance. So they use different technologies, but they work from your perspective very similarly in terms of keeping things in sync and doing a cutover when you are ready. And that cutover is basically the time it will take for managed instance to restore a tail log backup. Most companies have a backup plan where you keep log backups every few minutes or an hour or so, and that shouldn't take that long.
Thanks. And then one thing to add, I'm not sure if that's a public-facing application, but if it is, then you can use Traffic Manager, which is the DNS solution that Azure provides to help slowly move users over to the migrated instance rather than doing an all or nothing. So that's just also like a practice that we have there as well.
Okay, great, thanks.
Great. Over here.
Due to the Azure Arc announcement, we've been taking a serious look at Stack Hub and Stack HCI. How about migration into those platforms?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I had a reaction to it. I'm migration into Azure Stack, right? In the roadmap, I currently do not have an ETA to offer, but overnight I got a lot of similar questions as well. It's very logical, right? I mean, we truly do take pride in our hybrid story, so our cloud migration tooling also should be truly hybrid. The focus for the teams, quite frankly, over the last year has been to build the migration tooling, which we currently believe is far better than our competitors' tooling available. So in terms of the options that are available and the kind of maturity that we have in the tool set, Stack, even our dedicated VMware offering, those are the kind of target endpoints that we want to support next. We will start off in the very near future with building assessments for Stack, meaning through the Azure Migrate Server Assessment Service, you'll be able to indicate that I don't want to migrate to general purpose Azure, I want to migrate to my Stack instance. What would this assessment look like? That we will enable very shortly, but the actual migration piece will still be at least 6 to 9 months away.
And Stack Hub or Stack HCL or Edge or
Stack
all three?
Hub, as per the, if I understand the new branding correctly.
That's correct.
The answer that I gave was for Stack Hub.
Yeah, and just one clarifying. So Current Tech is a partner who's got some capability already today.
Two
Current
partners.
Tech.
Current and Zero. Zero Nines.
Zero Nines,
Yeah, Zero Nines and Current Tech are the recommendation currently to perform migration, but Microsoft will add native support.
Thank you.
Great. Here in the middle.
Yep. We are looking at migrating Teradata on-premise to the cloud. And since DMS does not support that, is there another tool or approach you recommend?
I don't know, to be honest.
Teradata, right? Is that what you said?
Yep.
Yeah, maybe we should just take an offline on that one and come back to you. Okay. Can you send one of us email on that? We'll give you the email aliases if you can stop by after the session.
Thank you.
Great. Over here.
So we've got about 400 SQL database servers in our environment, and we'd like to look at moving those to Azure. Is there a way to, using a tool or some other way, to evaluate, very quickly if those all could be moved to SQL as a service? And if so, what would the cost be to do that? And would they be compatible, or is there functionality that SQL as a service doesn't offer that they might need?
Yeah, so Database Migration Assistant has an assessment capability where you can point it to your server and it will go through and perform an assessment, and it can give you table level, script level, compatibility issues, and things like that.
Yeah, and I would add, you should also look at the MoveAir capability there, particularly for license counts and tracking. As customers look at, hey, what's the right mix of SQL cores and CAL licenses? I should look at some of the rich visualization capability in our MoveAir toolset as well. And we've got people from the MoveAir team right in the front row if you want to just double click with them.
So when you go to the Azure Migrate portal, there's a journey for Windows and Linux migration. There is also a journey for SQL and other databases. When you click on SQL and other databases, the first step that it offers you to execute is called database assessment, and that's exactly the step that he just described. That allows you to download our database migration assistant tool, perform the assessment. The Azure Migrate Hub will visualize all of it for you. It will tell you what the compatibility is, what are the breaking changes, are you ready for SQL MI, are you ready for SQL Azure, and then once you've decided, it will take you through the database migration flow, all interconnected in the hub itself. So you can directly discover it by going to Azure Migrate.
Great. Any additional questions? Okay. We had 2 whole minutes remaining. Any final remarks from my panelists?
Yeah, I will say just a shameless plug. I mean, if you guys feel like you got enough information on tools and all of that, I might also encourage you to consider the Azure Migration Program, where, beyond the capabilities, if you say, gosh, I just need help, ranging from help my people get trained to have a partner support me to just handhold me, help me do the plan, literally work with me as Azure engineers. Yeah, we just encourage you to go to azure.com and AMP and apply, and we'll just help you get there.
And we also have a booth for the Azure Migration Program in the Azure Migration and Adoption area. It's relatively near the Fast Track booth, and both of those are good destinations if you want to come sign up for a little bit of additional help or guidance, or even large-scale help and guidance with a migration project. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to my panelists. And if you have last questions, I'm sure they'll stick around for a few minutes after we close. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.